Otherwise, I welcome everybody to the event. My name is Ronny Patz. I work as adjunct faculty here at Hertie School in Berlin. When I'm not teaching at the school, I advise nonprofit and international organizations on the state of the art in academic research and research methods. Today, I welcome all of you to this workshop titled Insights into the OECD Data Science Engine Room. This event is hosted by the Hertie School Data Science Lab and jointly organized with the colleagues of OECD's Financing for Sustainable Development Division. This is also the final session of the master level course on the financing of international organizations that I've organized here at Hertie School this fall semester. The students in this course, who are in the same room as I am right now, have learned over these past weeks how to make sense of multilateral financing from regional to global international organizations, from traditional budgeting to earmarked voluntary contributions, from established development bank financing to new multilateral funding models. The students have also experienced firsthand how challenging it can be to collect and analyze multilateral finance data, and all of this is relevant for today's event. During the next more or less 90 minutes, we will be looking into the background and findings of the 2022 OECD Multilateral Development Finance Report. Most importantly, we will get to look behind the scenes of how data on multilateral finance is collected, analyzed, and turned into policy recommendations. To do so, we will first hear how this is done inside OECD, notably when producing the multilateral finance report, but also how OECD efforts in policy-oriented data science link and compare to efforts in the UN system, in global think tanks, and in academic research. For this, we are joined today by 4 outstanding experts on multilateral finance and data. Julia Benn is the head of the Statistical Standards and Methods Unit in the Development Cooperation Directorate of OECD, and Abdoulaye Fabregas is an analyst in the Policy Analysis and Strategy Unit in the same OECD Directorate. They are joined by Marisa Berbigal for the later Q&A. These 2 colleagues will start this session for the first 20 to 25 minutes and give us a glimpse into the data science engine room that produced OECD's report. Afterwards, 2 experts on UN system finances and data will intervene to put OECD's perspectives into a wider multilateral finance framework. The first intervention will come from Henriette Keijzers. Henriette, after working in the UN system on trust funds, now works as an independent consultant, and among other things, she's an advisor on UN finance data to the UN Chief Executive Board for Coordination Secretariat, as well as the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. Both of these organizations are crucial for making UN finance data accessible and intelligible. Second, we will hear from Svanhildur Thorvaldsdottir, who works as an assistant professor at the University of Iceland. Svanhildur is an academic expert on multilateral finance data, from a PhD thesis on donor influence in the UN system to a recent work on country-level financing of the UN's refugee agency, UNHCR, or the financing of IOM, the International Organization for Migration. After these 4 interventions, which should take about 45 minutes in total, I will open the discussion to the rooms here and the online crowd for a Q&A that you can ask any questions on the report or on the data science angle of the work that you've heard here in those 4 interventions. We shall end the event about 1:45 Berlin time. So without further ado, I hand over to Julia Benn and Abdoulaye Fabregas for the opening presentations of OECD's Data Engine Room.
Thank you so much, Ronny. So let me share my screen. Okay, and put the slideshow mode on. So I hope you can all see. Yes. First of all, big thank you to the Hertie School, and in particular to Professor Ronny Patz for hosting this event and putting together this great panel with great panelists. It's an honor for us to have this for the launch of our report. This is a refreshing event for us, thanks to its data angle that was suggested by Professor Ronny Patz. And we're really happy that it allows us to also talk about a part of our work that is usually less visible, at least for the Multilateral Development Finance Report. So we'll start with some key findings of our report, which has been released earlier this week. before talking a little bit about the data challenges that we face in analyzing multilateral finance. And then our colleague Julia Benn will talk more about the statistics on multilateral finance and all the great work that the OECD does on that front. So as you probably know, the Multilateral Development Finance Report is a biannual publication of the OECD. So it's published every other year. And its main purpose is to provide a state of play and an overview of multilateral development finance. So looking at a system-wide approach, so all type of multilateral development organizations. And this year's report points out that the global context, marked by more frequent crises and geopolitical tensions like those that we've experienced in recent years, is putting the multilateral development system under pressure and creating what we framed for the presentation as 3 paradoxes. The first paradox is that the multilateral system has never been as solicited, but at the same time as contested as it is now. And figure 1 shows, for example, that in 2020, multilateral development organizations committed record volumes of financing to developing countries. So it's around 230 billion USD, which represents a 37% increase compared to 2019. And so this confirmed that the multilateral system was able to assist developing countries in times of crisis by providing counter-cyclical support. Despite the key role that they played through this counter-cyclical report, we heard, for example, at the recent UN General Assembly in September, at the World Bank IMF annual meetings in October, or earlier this month at the COP, that several leaders were calling for revamping the multilateral system, and they highlighted that the current system is not fit for purpose to address all the global challenges that the world is facing, such as climate change. In addition to that, we also hear that the multilateral system is increasingly criticized and under fire for its alleged lack of effectiveness and also for the lack of whole of system accountability. And so the report this year makes the point that in a context of constrained development budgets, not hearing these calls for reform could be risky, in particular because it could discourage donors from continuing to invest in the multilateral system. The second paradox is that even though there is a growing volume and a growing share of official development assistance, so ODA, channels through multilateral organizations, the multilateral resources still fall short of meeting the needs of developing countries. And so figure 2, for example, shows that in recent years, the share of OECD DAC countries' ODA channels through multilateral organizations increased, for example, from 39% in 2015 to around 43% in 2020. However, the rise in multilateral contributions is unable to keep up with the growing financing needs. And an illustration of that is provided with figure 3, which shows that in recent years, the UN registered growing funding shortfalls for humanitarian assistance, with 2022 being a record year, with I think more than half of the humanitarian financing needs being unmet. And this leads me to the third paradox, which is that recent efforts to adapt the system to new challenges and crises are somehow adding to some of the existing problems of the multilateral architecture. So figure 4 shows that the multilateral development system remains dominated by a few vital players. So this is the 10 organizations on the left-hand side of the dotted line that account for 70% of total financing from the multilateral system. But the rest of the system on the right-hand side of the dotted line, which includes a lot of smaller and more specialized entities, is characterized by greater fragmentation. And in addition to that, the analysis in the report show that the number of active multilateral entities has continued to grow over the past decades, with new entities being created in response to successive crises. So the result of all that is a complex and fragmented system where it becomes difficult to have a clear understanding of the division of labor between different multilateral entities, and also of potential overlaps or gaps in their respective portfolios. So for example, figure 5 shows that more than 40 multilateral entities are active in sectors such as health, energy, or environmental protection. And so to conclude on the key findings, overall, what the report argues is that the recent calls for reform that we've heard in recent months are a step in the right direction, that indeed the system needs to evolve to address the new global challenges, but that the reform efforts should not focus only on increasing the financial capacity of the system, but also on addressing some other parts of the reform agenda that have been lagging behind in recent years, some of them being the issue of the fragmentation of the system, and related to that, some issues such as the lack of whole of system accountability, all areas that have seen little progress in recent years. So I'll stop here for the key findings. Of course, happy to come back to these during the discussion. And now moving on to the data engine room, as the title of the event put it. And here, instead of taking a step-by-step approach of our analytical process for the report, I'll mention some of the key challenges that we face in our work on multilateral development finance, and some practical steps that we've taken in recent years to address them. So, I mean, first of all, just to explain that the main purpose of our work on multilateral finance is to put data into action. A large part of our job at the OECD, as a lot of you know, is to provide the evidence base to policymakers to support the design of sound policies. And so the same applies to our work on multilateral finance. And for that reason, data and statistics are really the raw material for our work. So like in this famous Lego infographic by Brendan Russen, so we work to get from the raw data to concrete policy insights and recommendations. And this is achieved through the work of a lot of different units at the OECD. So the first data challenge that we want to highlight in our work on multilateral development finance is the need to deal with data from multiple sources. And Professor Ronny Patz, I mean, mentioned in the introduction, you know, that the multilateral system is comprised of a variety of multilateral entities with different business models, governance models, etc. And so we have data that is scattered across, you know, different sources. So we basically use 4 types of data for this report. One is macroeconomic data, drawing from OECD and IMF statistics, survey data to get a feel of, you know, the public perception on things like multilateral effectiveness, financial data to be able to track financial flows flowing to the multilateral organizations and how these organizations use these resources. And then lastly, also M&E and assessment data from initiatives like GPDC, the MOPAN network, or you know, the UN system as well. And some typical issues that I'm sure all of us have faced in our work on multilateral finance is uneven coverage and quality of the data. So creating, you know, overlaps and gaps. Then diverse methodologies, so data that is not comparable. And so you will see that, for example, in our report, we try to be careful when analyzing things like multilateral climate finance to not be mixing, you know, data that is reported using different methodologies. And then lastly, also different data formats, so which requires some previous work. So, I mean, most of it means that our data preparation process is quite time intensive, as is usually the case. And we need to be also careful to avoid things like double counting when dealing with these data sources. So nowadays, I think most of our data preparation is conducted with R, but I think we also use some other tools. Then second data challenge is that we're also faced with what we call data blind spots on multilateral development finance. So that means lack of available data, incomplete data, or data that does not have the required level of granularity for some analysis. And I think my colleague Julia will mention, you know, the case of donors' earmarked contributions to the multilateral system where there have been, quite some progress in recent years. The report also points to specific thematic areas where currently better data and statistics would be required to understand the multilateral contributions to these topics. And this includes topics, for example, such as gender, poverty and inequality, but also climate change and biodiversity. And in some cases, the use of techniques such as machine learning can help to answer some urgent policy questions where there is gaps, in data coverage or data that is not yet available. And so, for example, a couple of years ago, our division developed a machine learning project, the SDG Financing Lab, to help track the financing flows going to each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, using the data from the OECD CRS system. And so this allowed us, for example, in the last edition of the report, to look at the contribution of multilateral organizations to these 17 SDGs, as illustrated in the Sankey diagram. And now challenge number 3, which is to make sense of large amounts of financial data. And I heard in the introduction that this is also something that students at Hertie School are now very familiar with. So obviously, when we talk about large data sets, the word large is relative because we're not talking about big data here. But for example, we sometimes have to deal with questions from our members that we need to answer that require us to look at the wealth of data on multilateral development finance, and sometimes finding an answer to the question is not as simple. For example, we were asked last year by our members to analyze the complementarity of bilateral and multilateral aid portfolios, and for that we used cosine similarity as a measure of similarity to do what we call the portfolio similarity analysis. So we published a paper on this, and we also worked on a dashboard to make that a little bit more interactive. And so, as you can see in the screenshot, ultimately this allowed us to map, both bilateral and multilateral organizations, and that based on whether their portfolios overlap or whether they complement each other across different dimensions. For example, the geographic similarity of the portfolios or the thematic similarity of their portfolios. And by the way, just also here to mention that one of your students, Julian Katz, who worked with us both on the report, but also on this portfolio similarity analysis, made a great contribution to all our analytical work this year. And lastly, the last challenge to mention is the need to ensure that our analyses are useful to the needs of different multilateral stakeholders, whether they're public donors, private donors, multilateral organizations, or partner countries. And so we do that by trying to complement our publications and reports with digital tools, so users can conduct their own analysis. And so, for example, the dashboard that is shown on the right-hand side here, allows users to explore the earmarking practices of individual OECD DAC members. The ultimate goal being for us to ensure that the analyses are useful to policymakers and lead to concrete change. So I'll stop here, and I think we'll move on now to talk about the work that is done at the OECD on the statistics of multilateral finance.
Thank you, Abdoulaye, and I hand over to Julia.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm also really pleased to be attending this meeting. It's kind of nice that you have people who are interested in learning about what's happening behind the scenes to actually put out some data statistical series on development finance. So today we will focus on some of the issues that we are dealing with in multilateral development finance. So indeed, my unit is called Statistical Standards and Methods. So it very much focuses on the first area that Abdu was describing in his presentation. And I have, I think, 8 or 9 slides prepared for you. So let's first Abdul, please put the first slide. So I want to tell you something about, a few general lines on OECD data collection from multilateral development organizations. This work has been actually going on for a very long time. OECD statistics have, as you know, for long been the global reference for analysis of development finance, and the reporting from multilateral organizations is really a key element of this statistical collection to be transparent about how development finance is then being used in developing countries and also at the global level. The collection on what we call the multilateral outflows, so the activities that multilateral development organizations are undertaking in developing countries, has always been an integral part of OECD statistics on development finance. And here I need to emphasize the word in parentheses there. This is when I say this, I'm talking about the core funding. So it is the contributions that various countries make to the general budgets of multilateral organizations. Today, we have some 60 multilateral institutions that report to the OECD. And we also, in addition to, if you like, activities, concessional and non-concessional financing that multilateral agencies do, we today collect data on the private finance that they mobilize for developmental purposes. And this specifically relates to the data collection from multilateral development banks, but also a few UN agencies are participating in that. So then on the next slide, Abdul, please, there we have some information on a new statistical framework that we are developing, which is called Total Official Support for Sustainable Development. Now, this is a more recent initiative. I mean, we have been working on it, maybe it's close to 10 years now, but very actively since 2017. And why are we doing this? It is because we have seen a need to have a statistical framework that better captures the financing for sustainable development from the recipient perspective. So really focused on the cross-border flows to developing countries. And if you like the OECD data collection, the standard one that I explained previously, that looks at the financing really from the perspective of the countries that are providing the financing, whereas TOSSD tries to get to a better picture of what recipients then receive. And this is actually a very important element in the multilateral context, because TOSSD therefore collects data on the full spectrum of activities implemented by the multilateral system, whether they are financed from the organization's core budget or whether they are financed from their non-core or extra budgetary contributions. There are lots of things to say about TOSSD, but I am not going to focus on that, just to say that it also has elements which are really beyond the existing OECD statistics on development finance that relate to the 2030 agenda. Now, we have 3 years of data available for TOSSD, or 2 have been published, and the 3rd year will be published in January. But what is very important, or very, how do I say, positive for TOSSD, is that it is now recognized as the data source for one of the SDG indicators. The indicator is called 17.3.1. The target is about mobilizing additional financial resources for developing countries from multiple sources. And the decision to include this new indicator, revised indicator, in the framework was made by the UN Statistical Commission in March 2022. And OECD is a co-custodian of this indicator together with UNCTAD. Now, on the next slide, there is a very brief explanation on how TOSSD and the ODA or CRS system are different from one another. So TOSTI focuses on sustainable development, whereas the ODA system is really about measuring donor effort. You see here the differences in the key eligibility criteria, the main focus that I already explained, and then also the scope of flows covered. So if you like, when one looks at financing that developing countries receive from external sources, from their perspective, both a concessional and non-concessional financing are important, and there is also the private finance mobilized through official interventions. Whereas in the standard ODA reporting system, if you like, we only look at concessional resources and official flows. So in that sense, TOSSD is broader than the ODA reporting system. Now, then about the challenges. So, I mean, Abdul already kind of nicely put forward some of those challenges, and indeed these are really the ones that we are working on every day. But maybe just to elaborate a little bit from my perspective. So in the data collection exercise, I mean, we really need to distinguish between the inflows, so the contributions to the multilateral system, and then the outflows, which are the activities implemented by the multilateral system. So when we look at the information on the inflows, contributions that DAC members and other provider countries make to the multilateral system. So we have this list of ODA eligible international organizations, which is a basic tool for that. And there, the main challenge really is that while we are able to distinguish between the core and earmarked contributions, the information is not sufficiently granular on the level of earmarking of contributions to programs and funds managed by multilateral institutions. When it comes to the activities implemented by the multilateral system, so now looking at the data that we collect from the institutions for themselves, I mean, there I would say that is today still a lot of hard work. Why is that? Because these institutions, they have no formal obligation to report development finance data to the OECD. So in that sense, it is different from the ODA system, where DAC members, they are obliged to provide statistics to us. And then also, indeed, the reporting standards vary across organizations. I would say that the regular templates that we have for the ODA or CRS system, they are not really adapted to the multilateral organizations because they were simply designed for donor countries and have lots of details that are not really pertinent for multilateral organizations. TOSSD today is better fit for purpose for the multilateral data collection, and it also captures more granular data on activities funded from earmarked contributions. And today, actually, what we do is we have kind of done a combined template for the multilaterals so that we can collect both CRS and TOSSD data at the same time. Confidentiality of certain activities is also an issue. Maybe I won't elaborate on that one in the interest of time. Now on the next slide, we will then tell you something about the recent developments. So we have been working in the last couple of years, and actually with Henriette, nice to see you again, to see how our statistical taxonomies could be made more granular to be able to capture this additional level or address the need of additional level of earmarking in the data that we collect on a regular basis. And here, if you like, you see the codes or categories of modalities of development cooperation that we use in our system, and where the Working Party on Development Finance Statistics, so this is the body that kind of governs the data collection, on development finance in our systems at the OECD. They approved new subcategories of modalities to capture the level of earmarking contributions to the multilateral system. And this, as and when it is implemented, it will then allow for better analysis by the OECD. So there will be more interesting analysis or more accurate analysis in the multilateral development finance report. But of course, the data are also available publicly, and others can benefit from this too. I guess the only issue I need to add here is that, of course, implementation of these types of changes to the statistical system takes a bit of time. So we cannot expect that, next year everything will be perfect. It takes time for reporting countries to make these adjustments. But at least the fact that they have now been agreed, that is a very good step forward. Then on the next slide, we wanted to mention that over the past year, so we have really increased our collaboration with the multilateral system. I already mentioned the reporting template that we have worked on together with multilateral development partners. We are collaborating closely with the CEB Secretariat. And this is important because there we have looked at the harmonization and alignment of reporting by UN entities. And kind of having the idea of how could this be done so that everybody would benefit. So the CEB Secretariat, the OECD, our CRS and TOSSD collections, but then also IATI, the International Aid Transparency Initiative. And today we are happy to be in a situation where the UN data standards, they are really fully mapped and aligned with the CRS and TOSSD classification. And in the context of development of TOSSD, we also have two multilateral development banks as members of the task force, actively participating in the work, and UNCTAD is also an observer of this task force, very much involved. So then this is a picture that explains how to the provider perspective and recipient perspective play in our statistical systems. There's an explanation for the CRS, there's an explanation for TOSSD, and how TOSSD is getting to an improved picture of how the multilateral financing is channeled to developing countries. But in the interest of time, I think I will skip over this one and maybe if there are questions, so we can get back to that slide. And then there are two slides about how the TOSSD actually will then be able to capture a more accurate picture of financing that is channeled through the multilateral system. So this is about the UN entities, kind of showing how the core funding that is captured, if you like, in the CRS system, and the non-core funding that needs to be also reported by the multilaterals into the TOSSD, how in the case of some organizations, it is actually a big difference. I mean, some of this non-core funding is, it is available in the CRS system also, but the issue there is that when donors report on those contributions, they report it at a more general level. There are some thematic and regional programs where one in the CRS doesn't then see the details of the activities, whereas TOSSD, we go and ask the multilateral organizations on what did they do with the funding, and the information therefore becomes more accurate and more granular. And then I think there's this last slide, which gives an example of how this looks like when you look at the picture of development finance at the country level. So this is an example of Lebanon, and it shows how the, if you like, the TOSSD framework today can capture additional activities which are not shown in as detailed fashion in the CRS system today. So I think that is our slides. It's as you may imagine, quite challenging to run this type of a statistical system really globally. And one of the key elements there is really the standardization and harmonization. The better we can do in that area, the easier this becomes. And of course, all organizations will still have their specific needs. But one of the main objectives of an organization like the OECD is to try to work towards a situation where there would be more standardization, and therefore it would be easier for various stakeholders to do the analysis. And indeed, today we are trying to also look at tools like machine learning, because there are huge quantities of data. I mean, in our statistics, we want to make sure everything is quality assured, but we need to work on processes which help us to make this a bit faster. And in that context, we are also using machine learning, if you like, in the statistical quality checks that we do. So that's all from me. I hope I wasn't too lengthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia, and I know you have to leave soon, so I also thank you in advance, while I will thank the others at the end of the event. And I think Henriette Keijzers' intervention will follow neatly on the discussions you have introduced already. And so, Henriette, if you want to share your screen and talk about your perspective on multilateral finance.
Thank you, Ronny. I'm sharing my screen here. You should be seeing it. Maybe first, thanks to Ronny and the other colleagues there for the invitation to speak. It's always a pleasure to be on the same forum with Julia. I mean, we've been working together now since 2017, Julia, on all kinds of different things of making data systems and engineering work. And also, it's always nice to meet new people in the room who have been, in a way, working with this same type of data. So my presentation, I will focus on UN system-wide financial data and actually on the collaborative work in the engine room. Because ultimately, if we're getting our hands dirty, we're getting them dirty together. And together we're trying to figure out how we can make sure that all these potential data users have better data to work with. So if you're a data scientist or trying to become one, there's a lot of people to try to get you more or less clean data so you can do fun stuff. I will talk especially about the UN work, but before I do this, I put up one slide which in a way shows on why you need collaborative work. The OECD had a Lego slide. I'm using the terms of offense and defense in the time of the World Cup. Why not? And if you look at the UN Chief Executive Sports Secretariat, they are very much on the defense side of the UN system-wide data. They are looking at data security, at privacy, at quality, at compliance, at governance, and making sure that it's easy for data users to extract data. On the data offense side, there are all those users of UN system-wide financial data. Whether it's the OECD Dag, whether it's the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, with whom I've been consulted, UN MPTF office, which I worked with before, but increasing number of people are using the data. And it's this collaborative work, the ping-ponging between getting better data on the defense side and then having more data users who see further potential improvements, give that feedback so that you improve the data from year to year. And this is, in a way, one of the essential reasons why the UN data is where it is today. Now, of course, a lot is going on in the data, in this engine room. I mean, it's like the iceberg. Most of the stuff is below the iceberg. People who consult website, they normally see the beautiful graphs, which you see in the reports behind it. But as Abdoulaye already said, like there's an awful lot of work going on to get the data up to a shape where you can do this. And for the UN, on the left side, that's especially UN Chief Executive Board, who's the data steward for the data standards. That's the UN data standards. But behind that, there are more than 40 UN entities who, using the IPSAS, the International Public Service Accounting Standards, in the accounting systems, and have ERP systems that have to capture the financial data in order to be able to report all this data to the CEB, who then coordinates and consolidates it and then publish it on the website. On the right side, on the data offhand side, you have all the different data users who can do the data analysis, make assumptions, develop insights, have key messages. But again, the better and the easier they have access, the more time they have access to your data sets, the more fun they can have in the data analysis. So again, this collaboration between those people who are reporting the data, consolidating them, putting them out there, and those people using it. Then let me come to a short summary, which is complementing in a way the picture of what Julie already talked about, of what has happened in this UN system-wide data space. We have done a lot of work since 2017, 2018 under the tagline, maximizing transparency and minimizing effort in meeting the UN reporting obligations. Julie already referred to this, the transparency, the OECD multilateral development finance report also refers to the whole issue of trust. And it's also this issue of like, can we put out the data that we have in a transparent way so people see who's funding the UN and where the money is being used for. So that's one of the reasons why the financial data standards were adopted in 2018. There's basically 6 data standards. The graphic below, you see them, who's part of the UN system, what are the UN functions, where physical geographical locations is the UN getting its money from and spending its money, how, what financing instruments, why, how is it linked to the SDGs, and who's actually the contributors where the money is coming from. But the idea is basically that the data set that UN entities capture in the ERP system would enable them to report both to the CEB, but also to IATI and OECD with the very same data set. And then you can only do this if you harmonize your code lists and if you keep on learning and keep on improving. Julie already talked about this harmonized code list, so this is another way of presenting it. So across the 6 data standards, which the UN has right now, we now have completely harmonized code lists between the UN, the OECD, and IATI. That gives that comparability of data, and it also enables you to combine these different data sources and know that you're talking about the same thing. For instance, Julie already talked about how we worked on standard 4, the grant financing instruments, to make sure that those were completely aligned. Let me also mention that even on things like the UN entity, who is part of the UN entity, UN system, and how can we make sure that all these UN entities have a general code in the 41,000 codes of the CRS code list, and have also the IATI code list that again are similar to the OECD code list. That has been a major work behind the scene, engine room, dirty rooms, a lot of fun, but it's done. So that's one of the big things which has helped us to, in a way, build that collaborative work around improving the UN system-wide financial data. It has also been a successful work. So like, for instance, we introduced a data standard on linking the financial flows to the SDGs, which actually between OECD and the UN, they set their standard for this at the same time, and we made sure that we had exactly the same standard so that this would make it easy for any UN entity to code in their system and then report to both the UN and the OECD on this one. And this is a standard which actually became mandatory as of the 1st of January of this year. And we had, on the 2021 data, you can see it, 77% of total UN expenses linked to the SDGs. 39% against the target, 38% against the goals. We also had a code for UN entities that like there's certain activities, International Atomic Energy Agencies, many more. We said like UPU, Postal Union, what part of our mandate is not linked to the SDGs. So we introduced a non-SDG code. We had only 12% of total expenses not reported against this standard. So great result for us. We are super happy that this is moving. And of course, we are moving to get this last 12% of reporters also in next year. Of course, when you're successful, there's an increase of demand of data users for more UN system-wide financial data. And this increased demand for us, like I put down UN member states are asking this and say like, how can we use your data to report to the UN Congress, US Congress, for example, or how can we look at this whole of government contribution to the UN or to the outflows? There's the people using the data for reports, for think tanks, but also within the UN system, including for our common agenda and for the funding compact commitments or UN system-wide evaluations. So we saw that there was, as we were progressing on implementing this, how you call this, UN Data Cube initiative, and as we were successful, more and more demands were coming. So we decided to take our initiative to the next level. And basically, and this is my last slide, do a data cube strategy for 2022-25 and looking like what more is there that we need to do. And basically, if you see on the left, you see the data variables which we think that each UN entity should be tracking in their systems in order to report on the right to 6 different UN data cuts. And on the left, you see both the original 6 data standards, but we also developed a list of additional variables which sits in the UNCB minimum data set, which are the same variables which sit in the simplified reporting template that OECD has developed for the COS and USD. Basic activity level data, the gender marker, which next year will become the UN's 7th data standard. So we are currently incorporating that in the system, as well as standard financial information. And the idea is that if each UN entity captured this, they have the necessary information to both report to the CB financial statistics, which have been around, but also do more disaggregated level reporting on more on like high quality earmark funding like thematic funds or UN pool funds, and at the same time report to IATA and OECD on the activity level. Of course, not all of this reporting is mandatory, but we're trying to make the life easy for the UN colleagues so that we can maximize transparency while minimizing effort. And we hope that with this more ambitious vision, all put together in just one slide, we are able to keep going, keeping improving the UN system-wide data, making sure that we're doing on the defense side what we need to do, and making sure that this data are available to everybody. So let me stop here. This is the UN part of the engine room, a lot of collaborative work with the UN colleagues, all the UN tenders, with OECD DAC, with IATA, and many others who have given us feedback on, could we have this data? Can you publish this? So, and that motivates us as well to keep going. So back to you, Ronny.
Thank you, Henriette. And what I think everybody in this event has realized with the last 2 presentations, that the data science engine room is also a data standardization engine room that needs to be working well in order to do all of the fancy machine learning, analysis, visualization work that is the other part of the engine room. And one of the more, let's say, offensive users of UN data is Svanhildur Thorvaldsdottir, who is now giving her insights into actually using the data or not being able to use data in her work. And Svanhildur, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Ronny. Let me share my screen here as well. I just have a couple of slides, mostly to keep myself on track here. But first of all, many thanks to Ronny and to the Data Science Lab for hosting this event and for inviting me to participate in it. My comment, as Ronny mentioned, are largely from the perspective of somebody who is a user, who is not, gathering, who is not kind of putting the data together in the way that the OECD and UNCEF have been doing, but rather using it. And I'm drawing largely on my experience working with UN data collection. So this my comments may vary for other international organizations. And the data collection was largely taking place in 2017, 2018. So in the sort of years up until most of the developments that the other presenters have been talking about kind of started. And so my perspective is a little bit more looking back and talking about historical data collection, as opposed to the current changes that are being made in data collection and kind of the path forward. So my insights are based largely on this, and they're also based on a book chapter in a forthcoming book that on IO research methods. This was a chapter that I actually co-authored with Ronny Patz, who was my colleague for all of these data collection efforts. And so it's been interesting to hear the conversation so far, because many of the practical challenges that have been described were very much experienced by me as I was collecting this data. And so I think that one of the lessons learned I think for me is it would be wonderful to have more interactive dialogue with the other entities that are managing and working with this data, because again we share so many of the challenges. Where I think we diverge, however, is it has in part to do with the types of questions that academics are interested in that are often quite different from the ones that are asked by policymakers. So we may care sort of less about how things are implemented on the ground or things like that, but what we're really interested in a lot of the times is, how does money flow through international organizations? Who influences this process? Why are these new funding instruments implemented? Why is there this big increase in earmarked funding? And we're sort of interested in the political determinants of this, and sometimes less so in the actual output. And I think that this can lead to challenges in data collection and analysis that are particular to academics, or at least are more prominent for academics than they are for policymakers. And another kind of aspect of this is also a lot of the times we're interested in longer term trends. And so we want to be able to go back, and what we were doing, what I was doing in my data collection, we were going back all the way to the foundation of these organizations and looking at reports from the 50s and the 60s and et cetera, and trying to sort of put all of this together into a coherent data set that we could then do analysis with. And as was mentioned in the report, and as has come in the conversation, multilateral financing is indeed increasingly complex, both in scope and kind of what types of things are being reported, and in the types of instruments that are being used. And so just, for a brief example, looking at these annual reports from organizations, in 1951, the UNRWA annual report was 58 pages. This still included an incredible amount of detail on how money was being spent, where it was going, who was using it, to what purpose. And in 2004, this had grown to 126 pages, with a lot more complexity. And so kind of trying to map these things onto each other becomes increasingly difficult the more changes that are being made. And then interestingly, around this time also, UNRWA made some changes in the way it did annual reporting. So in 2006, we're back to about 40 pages of annual reports, but inconsistent with kind of the substance of these reports was not necessarily consistent with what was there in the 50s, right? So we're seeing a lot of these changes over time, and this brings some challenges in trying to collect data that is consistent for our purposes. And notably, sort of many of the attempts that we've seen to streamline and simplify are not always helpful for academics. We can see very well reading through these reports how this may be useful for donor states, for recipients, for the organizations themselves. But for us academics, sometimes this just creates more problems. And so, for example, definitions are oftentimes they're inconsistent across organizations. What is a budget? What counts as earmarked funding? These are inconsistent across organizations, but also oftentimes within organizations over time. And unless you're really looking at all of the footnotes, if you're just working with the raw data, a lot of the times you miss these. And so this is one of those things that whenever these changes happen, maybe we only see them because all of a sudden the numbers, the trends in the numbers drastically change, and we go back and try to figure out what's going on. And what's going on is that the definition changed, and this can add a lot of time to sort of data collection and cleaning for us. There's also, these are just examples from things that we noticed. Some agencies will shift from annual reporting to biannual reporting and then go back to annual reporting. And so we've had situations where, we had to subtract out the 2-year funding that was there from the previous year in order to figure out what that annual funding was, because that was the unit of analysis that we were interested in. And so these are sort of very practical problems that we come across. But again, this, the fact that these things change over time is hard for us. And in addition, there are oftentimes a lot of shifts in the types of things that are reported, and we see this in particular in sort of there was this trend towards more thematic reporting. So we're not just looking at which country is getting how much money, but what are they getting it for? And once we switch to what are they getting it for, a lot of the times the country itself gets lost. And so it's at the continent level, how much money is being spent on a specific issue within a continent, and not within a specific country. And for our purposes, again, this becomes problematic if our unit of analysis is sort of a recipient country. And so it can be quite challenging to track this process through the multilateral system, especially if we're going back in time, which a lot of the times is what we're interested in. We want to see why changes are happening and how they're changing across longer time periods. And so these are just sort of some of the issues that have emerged for us. And just to bring up, and I would be interested, I think there are some other academics here in the room who also work with some of this data, and I think it would be interesting to hear to what extent their ideas or their challenges have been similar to mine. But what is extremely helpful for us is this consistency in reporting. So that we're seeing, if we're seeing money coming into the organization or going out of the organization, that there's consistency across time, how that happens. And so I've put up here on the screen just screenshots from the UNHCR financial reports in 2009 and 2010. And what you will see here is this annex to statement 1, the detailed statement of income and expenditure by fund, region, country, territory, is no longer there in 2010. This is sort of a very, small change probably for most people, but for us, it means that we were no longer able to look at where UNHCR was putting its money. It was simply not there anymore in the report. And not only that, but it was no longer there in any report that was put out by the UNHCR. And so for 2010 onwards, we had to go to UNCEB data to get these numbers, which we know because of the way that organizations vary, or at least at this period sort of were varying in their reporting to UNCEB, may or may not be entirely consistent with how the organization is reporting itself. So we notice discrepancies between what the organization itself is reporting and what is being reported through the Chief Executive's Board. And so we know that we're sort of introducing a bit of measurement error in our data. It's hard for us to estimate how much, but these are the things that consistency in reporting can really help with. And in addition, what I mentioned before, the consistent definitions, what does earmarking mean, right? For different organizations. And we noticed this sort of going back in time, that earmarking is happening, I think, to a greater extent than we tend to acknowledge, because it was simply not called earmarking before. And so looking at reports from the 60s and the 70s have things that we might define as earmarking, but it wasn't being defined that way in the reports themselves. And so we miss it when we're collecting the data. Of course, increased granularity is really important for us. And I think that this is, so it's really great to see all of the steps that are currently being taken and all of the things that are being done to increase this granularity. But for us, again, what's going to be also really important is being able to aggregate from this granularity to something that is compatible with what was happening previously. So can we actually back this out and see and compare with data from the 80s or data from the 90s? But I think the granularity is completely fantastic, and I'm really excited to work with the data that's been coming out in the past few years, and that's going to sort of be coming out. And this is, again, on the sort of harmonization of access. Being able to access historical data varies a lot across different international organizations, even within the UN system. Some organizations simply do not make their data as available as others. They come in a variety of formats, and so this kind of harmonization, I think, would be really important and useful for academic purposes. As well as the ability to access the raw data, as much raw data as possible. Getting sort of the aggregates or the summaries are oftentimes not as useful for our purposes, because we kind of like to be able to put things together in different ways and kind of really explore what's happening inside the organization and kind of try to track what happens inside the organization. So in the past, it's been really hard for us to track sort of money coming in, maybe earmarked funding, and where exactly it goes. This is historically, this is almost impossible. And hopefully with some of the new data that's coming out, we're going to be able to kind of, open that black box of what happens inside the organization and kind of see the funding flows more specifically. And last but not least, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, this is not just a technical problem, right? Like this is a political problem. And so if donors are not willing to provide have sufficient transparency in the data that they're providing, in their donation practices, we can't do anything unless there is willingness from the donor community to really engage with organizations to provide the data that we really need in order to be able to engage in this type of analysis. So I'll leave it at that, but happy to answer questions, and I'm really looking forward to the dialogue that is following on. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Svanhildur, and thank you, everyone, colleagues, for the insights into the different parts of the engine room, or engine rooms potentially. And I would now open the floor to the classroom here and the online audience for questions. I would collect 3 questions in a row. Please ideally address a person with your question, and then I'm gonna catch a few raised hands, but also if you put into the chat your questions, I will read those out afterwards. So I see one hand raised from Maggie. Maggie, if you want to start.
Thank you, Ronny. Thank you, everyone, for the inspiring presentations. They were really interesting and very inspiring. My name is Maggie. I am a student of the Hertie School in a class of Ronny, and I am online because I am currently in Paris. I work for UNESCO in the sector of social and human sciences under Madame Gabriela Ramos, who used to work for the OECD for a long time, actually. And your presentations were super interesting, and they kind of connect with each other very well. And I had prepared already some questions, but many of them were already answered by your presentations. Of course, there's a clear lack of resources and fragmentation in the system when it comes to lots of efforts in data collection, and not just in multilateral development financing, but also in many other sort of international organizations. We're all trying to translate data into action, and of course there are many challenges along the way, but it's very interesting to learn about the TOSSD, and I feel like that this tool has addressed a lot of the problems with complementarity and coherence in the data ecosystem, and especially also in terms of fragmentation. And also very importantly, it sort of made sure that the data available is also accessible for lots of people who are trying to use it, and it stays in the public realm. My question in terms of practical utilization of the data, also in connection with some of the work that we do at UNESCO SHS, is whether you have any examples of practical applications of the use of such financial data in reducing social inequality or fighting climate change. Because that connects to a lot of the stuff that we're trying to do, like on the ground with the data available. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, for the question on the data usage and the impact of data. I have Annalisa here in the room, and then I have Bernard Reinsberg raising their hands, and then we can have a first round of answers.
Thank you for your presentation. It was super insightful. And like Maggie said, you already answered a lot of the questions we thought of. So I'm Annalisa. I'm also a student in the class here. And I'm currently working also with data science in the public sector in Germany. So it's really interesting to see how far along the databases are that you were talking about, because you can actually see that even in Germany, like a lot of the databases are not as complete or like well structured and thought through as the ones you're using. So I was wondering, for the new system you developed, the TOSSD database at the OECD, which assumptions did you make that actually need to hold in the data for it to be like true and workable? And also, I do recognize that you made a tremendous effort to capture more financial flows. However, the way I read it, the TOSSD is still not capturing the south to south financial flows and transfers necessarily. And is there any way you are estimating those or accounting for their missingness, or how do you account for missingness generally, if you could elaborate on this? And secondly, I would be super interested to hear which kind of models for machine learning you're actually using, if you can tell a little bit more about that, because that sounded super interesting, and I would love to hear more about it. And then, yes, for the second part, for the UN database, I was wondering if, Henriette, you could elaborate on the gender marker that's going to be introduced, like if there's a concept that you could already share with us and how you're going to add this to the data that's already there, like in retrospect. That would be super interesting to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Annalisa. And then Bernhard for the third question, and we can have a first round of answers.
Thank you very much, Ronny, and all the participants for this great session. And I would also like to laud the OECD for pointing the spotlight on data gaps. I think it's really the public good that we need to make a step change with in order to build a better financed multilateral system moving forward. And I want to reiterate one point that Svanhildur made in her excellent presentation, which was that we shouldn't forget that the data are only as good as the political processes that allow for it, right? So how do we know that donors actually have an interest in improving reporting? Or to give you just one example in this, right? So some could potentially want to hide multilateral contributions as earmarked because they have to fulfill certain quotas, right? So bilateral versus multilateral is an issue still. Or another example is the treatment of pass-through IOs like Gavi, the Jeff, and then others. So that's an issue that we have been discussing in my own project on the effectiveness of earmarked funding. again, this is entirely political, what counts as sort of independent multilateral, right? But how you count it will have an effect on how the statistics look like in the end. And I would like to ask essentially, so if I had to put one question out, right? I wonder now, with the introduction of all these great statistical standards that we see, this is of course really, really good, and but it should always have been done like this, right? So we will not get better data in the historical time series. So what are the approaches and potentially plans to extend retroactively the missing data from the past, or is there any way actually to recover these reporting categories, considering now that we know what we actually want in terms of data? Thank you.
I would hand over to Abdoulaye and Marisa for the OECD perspective, and then Henriette, you can go in after.
Thanks, Ronny, and thanks all for the excellent questions. So I mean, I'll start with the question about the examples of practical application of how this type of data, has been used in fighting inequality or in the fight of other global challenges. I think one practical application of our analysis that I like to refer to is our work on transition finance, which basically looks at trying to analyze how developing countries, when they transition through different development stages, so for example, when they move from low income to middle income, or when they graduate from certain lists, for example, the list of least developed countries, how over time their financing mix evolves. And for that type of work, that's also another example where we always rely a lot on all these data sources that were mentioned during the presentation. In that case, it's not only looking at multilateral finance, but that's part of what we're looking at. We're also looking at bilateral flows, at private sector flows, at tax revenues from developing countries' governments, and really trying to see how over time, as a country develops and the concessional flows, both from multilateral and bilateral donors, decline, how can this be replaced optimally by other financing flows, whether it's private flows or domestic resource mobilization. And this is a quite practical example, because we also conduct what we call transition finance country diagnostics. So based on demand from the OECD DAC members, they ask us to look at the specific context of some countries. The last one we did was in the Solomon Islands, in the context of SEEDS, so small island developing states in the Pacific, that was graduating from the list of least developed countries. And so I think that's a practical example. On the question regarding the machine learning, so I'll just answer on the one which I showed, which is the SDG Financing Lab. So, I mean, I'm myself not a specialist in this, so I'd like to refer you to the web page of the SDG Financing Lab, and in particular to the publication that is mentioned there, which is called Linking Aid to the Sustainable Development Goals, a machine learning approach, where the full model and the approach of this machine learning project is described in length. I think it will be a lot more accurate than if I try to describe it here. And then, I mean, passing on to before passing on to Marisa, just want also to thank Bernard Reinsberg, who also asked a question, and who I think during the presentation that Henriette did, I really liked the slide where she mentioned how increased demand by data users led to some progress. I think in academia, in international organizations, in governments, we're all data users in some form, and we're part of this by pointing to the areas where data can be improved. It's a kind of a feedback loop, and I just want to acknowledge the work that people like Bernard, now with University Glasgow, and also other researchers such as Silke Weinlich from IDOS have done on topics like earmarking, where they really pointed us to where there were gaps in the data and where things could be improved. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Abdul. So I will introduce quickly myself because I did not present. So I work in Julia's team in the Statistical and Methods of the Financing for Sustainable Development division, and I particularly coordinate the data collection of UN entities, global funds, and countries that are not members of the Development Assistance Committee. So I can respond to this practical question of about how to access the data and how the data is reported, and also how countries have or not have incentives to report on bilateral versus multilateral, etc. So to complement on Abdu's comment about how to look, for example, for how data on social inequality reduction, etc. In the TOSDI database, for example, you can look for data by SDG target. So if you find an SDG target that you can assign to your question, you will find all the activities for 2019 and 2020. And in a few weeks, you will find 2021 data as well for SDG targets. And on climate finance, so you can refer to, in the CRS, you have what is called the Rio marker. So you could look at this kind of source of finance. So on adaptation, mitigation, biodiversity, and desertification. And then we have the keyword field in the TOSDI data. So if you're looking for a particular, for example, recipient country, and then you download the database, then you can find the keywords adaptation or mitigation. So for example, when multilateral organizations report on climate components to us, that's collected in the CRS, but then on TOSDI will appear the keyword adaptation or mitigation. So that will appear from 2021 data, so in a few weeks, because we implemented in the course of this year. So on the question of South-South cooperation, it's actually captured in TOSDI. It was not captured in ODA. We have 20 countries reporting to us, some of which they consider South-South cooperation, for example, like Turkey or Qatar, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia. But they also consider that their cooperation fits within the ODA framework. Then we have other countries that consider that their definition did not fit within the official development assistance framework, and we never kind of got to the point where we engaged with them so that they could report on their development finance to us. But now in the context of TOSDI, we have already data from Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Peru, Nigeria, Thailand, and Indonesia. So the number of South cooperation provided beyond the ones that were already reporting in the context of the CRS, so they also report to TOSDI. So we do have a lot of countries that report on South-South cooperation in the context of TOSDI, and we also do some estimates in the development cooperation report that the OECD produces. There are some estimates on kind of big development cooperation providers, or that they are closer to the OECD. For example, there might be accession countries that don't report to the CRS. So for example, in China, we do some estimates. And then on the machine learning, we are also developing in our team a tool for SDG target, and we are not kind of offering that to the public yet because it's kind of developing the algorithm, but we are using increasingly also to revise our data. And for example, we have been in the multi-partner trust fund office of the UN. They are also developing an SDG learning tool. So in a few weeks, we are having a meeting to kind of compare results on what our data, for example, propose, our machine propose on their data, and vice versa. And then finally, about countries' willingness or incentives to improve reporting. Sometimes it's, as it was mentioned before during the presentation, when there is more demand for data, then there is also more responsibility for countries to report. And sometimes the organization like civil society, etc., they kind of point at these kind of flags in the data, so that it also provides additional incentives to improve the data. And we, for example, when we look at the modalities for core versus earmark contributions to the multilateral system is something that we particularly look at very carefully, because it affects the double counting mechanism when we build the recipient perspective. So that's something we kind of try to encourage reporters to improve. And about plan to extend retroactively missing data. So in the CRS context, we have data for a very long time. So we have long data series. In the TOSD, it really makes sense with the approval of the 2030 agenda. So when the methodology was finished, it was 2019, and we don't have data before that. And we don't think it makes sense to have retroactive data, because this agenda and the framework that it's represented, the data is reflecting, is really in the mindset of countries and organizations now, but it wasn't back in 2010. So I don't think it would make sense to have this data back then. And I think that's everything. If necessary, I can complement later. Thank you.
Henriette.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, all the speakers. It's so fun to listen to everybody. And maybe let me just start with one first remark. And it's basically, if you think of, I'm looking at Marissa and Julia and their outfit around the CRS and TOSD, and you compare it with the CB Secretariat. The CB Secretariat in Geneva is tiny. So I'm not saying that if there's increased demand for data, there's any capacity at the center to necessarily deal with all the demands. So we're really trying to prioritize what really needs to get done and have a vision out there, precisely also to make sure that UN entities know, like, okay, this is what is being asked in the coming 3 to 4 years. I adjust my ERP system. I prioritize, for instance, putting the gender marker in my system so that in 3 years' time, I can report. So that's maybe just one remark up front. I have a lot of other things, but let me stick to the questions. First, on the practical application of the data on the ground. Maybe when I got involved in this project, my tagline, what I want the Secretary General at some point in the future to be able to say, in this and this year, my UN system spent so much money on this SDG target in this country, and these are the results that were produced. Do we have that? Not yet. It will take a lot of intermediate steps. But what we see right now in the UN system, that you have, like, for instance, on the development side, you have something like UN Info. On the humanitarian side, we have UNFTS, what OCHA is coordinating. And they're not yet completely linked to what the CB Secretariat is doing with all the data cuts that you see. And those two should come in the coming 3 to 5 years together, so that you have that complete list between results being captured at country level against humanitarian results plans, sustainable development, cooperation frameworks, and the finances, and people using the same database. You're not yet there. I mean, the vision is there, but it's just not yet there. So, but what we're doing as intermediate step, and just to respond to your question, is also trying to see, can we get disaggregated data? Can we get a data of, like, how much as a UN entity spending in a country on an SDG with core, non-core, core or non-core other resources, so that you have not that granular data, but that also you can know for those things which sit in the system and those things that not, a more comprehensive idea of how much is the UN actually spending in a country. Because certain data is captured in OECD, but certain data is not. If you look for how much money flows to the UN and you only look at the OECD as data source, there's huge financing flows will just not be there, even if because they are, for example, not linked to the SDGs. So maybe that's just one practical thing. The other thing is also looking at system-wide evaluations and seeing how increasingly the data can be used to say, okay, the UN is in this country, or this UN entity is focusing on this SDG target. If I want a system-wide evaluation, these are the UN entities. This is the financing flows on which I have to look at. a lot more, but yeah, we see it starting trickling down, and also everything that academics are testing. I mean, if you do some cool stuff with the data, let us know, because basically we might learn things like, okay, this is also something we could do within the UN system. And we, then I'm saying, for instance, the CD Secretariat. On the gender marker, we worked with IATI and OECD on coming up with a gender marker. The UN had already a gender marker, which had a 4-point scale, but it's directly mappable to the 3-point scale of the OECD DAG policy marker, which IATI also has in their system. So what we're doing now is telling all the UN entities, and not just the 6 UN entities who are currently reporting to IATI using the gender marker, to say, please prioritize having this in your ERP systems so that across your full portfolio, if you're doing activity level report to IATI or OECD, you can include this variable. So, and that's, so we've gone through the approval process. So this is now approved at the level of the UN, high-level Committee on Management. From there, it gets introduced. There's a 3-year transition period. Some people may need more time, but it's saying like 3 to 5 years from now, we should have far better. Ideally, we should have all activity level data of the UN report to IATI and OECD, and having the gender mark as part of the variable. We might not get 100%, but at least if you get 70% of that vision, would be fantastic. Bernard, on your question on retroactive, there's different things. One is the issue, of course, that if you look at the CB website, there are PDF reports with numbers, which going back to 92, and probably all the reports can still be found. Of course, that's not very useful. One thing of, at least we're looking at for the current biannual report on the budget and financial situation of the UN, to not just put the document in the PDF version, but to see also if we can just put the Excel sheets online for those things which don't yet sit in the UNCEB like data set. Like for instance, the percentage of assessed contribution that each member state has to pay. Like it's a 24-page table with a font which is smaller than 6. And of course, that's not useful for any data user. So can we just put this in Excel? So then, but the one other thing on what we've done retroactive is we introduced this definition of functions, like humanitarian assistance, development assistance, the global agenda, and peace operations. And we have, for most of the past 10 years of data, been able to get organizations to remap. We have a few UN entities which are still remapping. And as this gets remapped, this would be then available going back to 2010 on the CB website. So I can talk a lot more. I love this stuff, but Ronnie's telling me, we have to wrap up. And of course, other people need to give the floor. So back to Ronnie.
Thank you, Henriette, and colleagues for answering these rounds of questions. I assume all of you are more or less available for follow-up questions, for input, and if anybody cannot reach you directly, please come through me and I will direct the right questions. Are still in the chat, so if you haven't seen any answers, please let us know. I just want to take up one question from Sarah from the chat that I will turn into a demand, and this is all of these efforts are now producing different websites. Everybody puts out their Excel sheets, their downloadable CSVs, whatever. Can we get to a point where we have a single website where all of these data sets are at least summarized in a accessible, simple way? What we've heard today, the interconnections between them are understandable for a lay and an expert audience. If we could get to that point in the next years, with all of the efforts already being coordinated, I think that would be a great help to all of the data scientists who then put on their big models on something that they can actually combine into something potentially bigger. With this little question turned request, I want to thank, first of all, Huy Dang, the manager of the Hertie Data Science Lab, for hosting this event. I want to thank Jeong Kim and colleagues at OECD for coordinating the substance of the event today. I want to thank the speakers, Julia, Abdoulaye, Marisa, Henriette, and Svanhildur for being available and for your expertise in this event. And I want to thank all of the participants for being with us, listening and asking questions using the chat. And if you're working in the domain of multilateral financing, do not hesitate to get in touch, as I said before. And if any of you look for young experts on multilateral finances, the students here in the room, I think, would be very happy to be engaged, involved. So get in touch if you need experts for your work, and I will also relay your work to them. So again, thank you everyone for your insights, and we will see each other in this nerdy universe of IO finances, I think, in the coming years. Thank you, and have a good December. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.